The next section of Mark that we want to look at is the last part of Mark chapter 4 and Mark chapter 5. And I would classify these pericopes as testifying of Jesus' power in more intense ways than we've seen already in the gospel. The first story concerns Jesus calming the storm, and it's connected with the healing of the demon-possessed man or men in all of the synoptic gospels. Here we see the power of Jesus over nature, and we also see that in the midst of his miracle, he rebukes the disciples for their lack of faith, and their response to this is one of awe at what Jesus can do. The second story that we find in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, is Jesus healing the demon-possessed man. Again, this is described in all the synoptic gospels, and it is combined with the calming of the storm in all of those gospels. In Matthew's account, there are two demoniacs mentioned rather than one. And so I think it's safe to assume that the authors are connecting the power of Jesus over demonic forces and Jesus' power over natural forces as well. In this account, we see that the demoniac comes to Jesus and falls at his feet. Now, that phrase, falls at his feet, is often translated worship. In fact, some of the older English translations will say that this demoniac worshipped Christ. I think the newer translations are probably more accurate, that the demoniac fell at Jesus' feet, not in an act of worship, but more as a consequence of being in the presence of God and not being able to stand. It was not something freely offered, but it was something that was forced on the demons by the reality of the situation they were facing. Here we see that the demons recognize Jesus as the Son of the Most High. And that's a little bit different wording than we have in other cases of delivering of demoniacs. And it's been suggested that this is because where Jesus is right now is in the region that is of the Decapolis, which is actually primarily Gentile, and it may reflect the term Elion, which to the Gentiles was the Most High God. So it would be the demons' way of expressing the truth of who Jesus was in a Gentile context. And so that might describe why there's a difference here, although Jesus is also referred to in this way in the announcement to Mary. The legion, or the many demons that are in this possessed man, don't want to leave the area, and so they request that they could go into the herd of pigs. And when Jesus grants this request, the pigs go running off a cliff to their doom. Some modern commentators and critics of the Bible see this as Jesus not being sensitive to the owner of those pigs. I don't think that that's the way we should interpret the scripture. What we should look at instead is that this man's freedom, or men's freedom in the account of Matthew, is more significant than the fate of pigs. Remember too that pigs were seen as unclean to the Jewish people, and so it was appropriate that the unclean spirits went into the unclean animals. It is also been suggested that this shows the intent of the demons that were possessing this man, that they were destructive. They were bent on destruction. So if he had not been delivered, it is conjectured that the demons would have driven the man as well to suicide. So those are some of the reasons why Jesus might have done this. He certainly wasn't acting in obedience to the demons. Certainly he had reason for allowing this that was quite apart from the demon's own desires. And if nothing else, it has served as a very dramatic story throughout the history of Christianity. You can go online and look at all kinds of different representations of this particular deliverance. So that is quite interesting. Now, the people who were tending the pigs, they went back to the city and told others, and they came back. And when they got there, the thing that amazed them more than anything else was that this demoniac, or these demoniacs, were in their right mind. That scared them when they saw this guy who was completely out of control, now suddenly sitting there clothed in his right mind. That scared them more than what had happened to the pigs. And so we often wonder about human nature, but when they saw this incredible miracle, it frightened them, and they didn't want Jesus near them because they were scared of his power. And so they asked that he would leave, and of course, Jesus is not going to go where he's not wanted, so he did leave. And as he was leaving, the man wanted to go with him, but Jesus said, no, stay here and testify to what God has done for you. Now, if you've been following this study, you know that this is completely out of character for Jesus. He's always telling them, don't say anything, keep it quiet. He wants to keep his ministry as much out of the public attention as he possibly can, because his time has not yet come. But in this situation, when the man is in Gentile territory, and the concern about the religious authorities finding out or worrying about news that the Messiah had come would not be an issue in Gentile territory, because that's not how they viewed the world. He was free to go and speak as publicly as he wanted about what Jesus had done, and everybody who heard it was amazed, because remember, this man would have been known. He was totally out of control, and so his testimony would have been very powerful to the people in that area, and that was the case. So the next section I've titled, Jesus Heals the Two Daughters. Once again, all three of the Synoptic Gospels have this. Matthew places this particular incident just in a different place slightly, but all of them have this story, and they have the accounts of these two daughters together. Some scholars claim that it's placed together for effect, but as I said, all of the synoptics have these two together, so there are those who believe that this is the way that the events transpired, that they're not just put together for emphasis, but they're put together because they happen simultaneously, which I tend to agree with too. I don't see any reason why this story shouldn't be kept as one unit. It begins with Jairus, a synagogue ruler, which would have been a lay position in the synagogue. He wasn't a priest. He didn't have any priestly duties, but it was a position of power and prominence. They would be in charge of organizing the services. They might be in charge of overseeing the building. In some cases, it was an honorary title placed on people. So but it was a position of significance. And the fact that Jairus came and humbled himself by kneeling before Jesus and pleading for his daughter showed that he was a man who was desperately looking for help. And we don't have Jesus responding or saying anything to him, but he got up and followed him and went with him. And we are told that the crowds were pushing in on him from all directions, but that while he's walking through the crowd, there was a woman who had been experiencing bleeding for 12 years. And she reached out from behind and just touched the corner of his garment and was hoping to be healed. Now, this moment and these actions reflect both her faith in Jesus, but also a sense of superstition. And there was a belief that, the power of a person was on their clothing. And so she believed that. So she thought if she could just touch him, his clothes, then she might be healed, because she believed that he was a healer. But Jesus knew immediately that this woman had touched her and was looking around. She said, "Someone has touched me. I know it." And of course, the disciples, everybody's been touching Jesus. It's not like social distancing. There's no social distancing going on. Everybody wants to be close to Jesus. They're all crowding around him. And inevitably, many people are touching Jesus. But that's not what he meant. And the woman, of course, she knows that Jesus is talking about her. And she comes to him and she confesses what the whole story about how she'd been sick and how she just wanted to touch him so that she could be well. And Jesus says that your faith has healed her. And this is powerful because it reminds us that all healing is personal. That the power of Jesus is not some impersonal force, but it is power based on relationship. And that this woman was receiving healing from Jesus, and it was personal. Jesus didn't have to call her out, could have just let her walk away having experienced healing, but he wanted her to know that God saw her as a daughter, that he cared for her, and that this healing was not taking something from the divine, but it was given as a gift to her. And I think that is a profound truth in this story that we don't want to miss. And just as that's happening, members of Jairus' household inform him that his daughter has died. And they say, well, don't bother the teacher anymore. But Jesus, in contrast to that, says, don't fear, but believe. And when they get to Jairus' house, there's all kinds of people crying and mourning and clapping. This was something that was customary in the Middle East, that when someone died, you paid mourners to come and help with the grieving process by just being sad. And so these professional mourners were there. And that when Jesus suggested that the child was asleep, the mourners laughed at him. And so you see how they were not personally connected with this girl. They didn't really have any care about this girl. They went from mourning to laughing in an instant. But this word asleep is used in reference to death is quite interesting, because this is a Christian invention. That the idea of connecting death with sleep was not an ancient thought. It wasn't an idea that was around in Jesus' time. People were very much aware that death was, in many ways, the end. But it was Jesus who turned death into sleep, because he conquered death. And so death is no longer the ultimate end. And death now becomes for us, because of Christ's victory over death on the cross, a manner of sleep. But anyway, they laughed at him. when it came to performing this miracle, Jesus only allowed Peter, James, and John, his inner circle, to join him. And the mother and father were there. And this is a very sacred moment where Jesus is doing something powerful. We've titled this section, Jesus working with power, right? And he showed power over the storm by calming it. He showed power over demonic forces, even forces that had made a person completely out of their mind. And now we see power being released through merely touching his garment. And now we see power over death itself. But those who are laughing are not to witness this. They didn't get to witness the resurrection of this child. The only ones who were invited were Peter, James, and John. And it shows us that while it's possible to witness a miracle, there's a difference between witnessing a miracle and understanding what's going on. And so just his closest friends come with him, and Jesus raises that child from the dead simply by taking that little girl's hand and say to her, little girl, get up. And for Jesus, it was that simple. And what did he do? As soon as she was up and feeling better, he was very practical. He said, find her something to eat so she could be strengthened. And then, once again, told them to keep quiet about this. Now, there's no way that Jesus could have expected that nobody would have heard about this. The mourners were just outside. People were going to know. But he didn't want to make it worse. He didn't want to make it more known to people. And so he urged them to keep it quiet. Again, there's a secretness of the kingdom. The time for all things to be revealed was yet in the future. But these miracles that we've looked at today show further the power of Jesus over nature, over evil, over sickness, and ultimately over death.